The Gospels of the New Testament give us insight into the life of Jesus and his apostles. A common objection to the Gospels is that the authors are anonymous. So, did the apostles, or men who knew them, write the Gospels? And what do scholars say on this issue? To start off, who are the Gospels originally attributed to? The earliest written Gospel is that of Mark in around 65 to 70 AD. The supposed author of Mark is said to have been a follower of Peter and is thought to have been mentioned multiple times in the book of Acts. Most scholars then establish Matthew as coming next in the early 80s AD. Traditionally, Matthew, of course, is the tax collector mentioned in the various Gospels, who also goes by the name Levi. Matthew, or Levi, becomes one of Jesus' apostles, although he is not mentioned as much as the others. Luke is said to be written not long after Matthew's Gospel in the mid-80s AD. Luke is also a follower of Paul, and there is some debate over whether or not Luke was Jewish, with some scholars believing him to be a Gentile. Finally, John is traditionally attributed to John the Apostle, who is one of the main apostles mentioned in all Gospels. John was a fisherman and was called by Jesus early on in his ministry to follow him. Now that we've established the basics, what is the internal evidence that the Gospel authors are the apostles, as in the case of Matthew and John, or use eyewitness testimony as in the case of Mark and Luke? To start off, the Gospel authors have consistent knowledge of the geography of Judea, or Israel/Palestine, during the reign of the Roman Empire as shown above with reference to towns and regions. New Testament scholar Peter J. Williams states, "The four Gospels demonstrate familiarity with the geography of the places they write about. In total, they mention 26 towns, 16 each in Matthew and Luke, and 13 each in Mark and John. Among the towns listed are not only famous places like the religious capital Jerusalem, but also small villages. Even in John's Gospel, he mentions various bodies of water consistently more than any other Gospel, of course, John being a fisherman. Now, of course, this does not prove that they wrote it, but it's to be expected if they are eyewitnesses in Judea, or are using eyewitness testimony. John's Gospel also claims to be written by an apostle. For example, we read in John chapter 21, verse 24, a claim coming from Jesus' beloved disciple. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. Now, a quick objection made to the Gospels is that none of them claim to be written by their attributions, and that their titles which bear their names were written on them after. The issue with this line of reasoning is that this was common in the ancient world, and especially with Greco-Roman biographies, which the Gospels are said to be. Take, for example, one of the most famous Roman historians around this time, Cornelius Tacitus, who is said to have written the Annals, which record the reign of various Roman emperors in around 117 AD. Yet, Tacitus never claims to write this document in the Annals. It takes outside sources to confirm this. For example, the Christian historian St. Jerome, who put together the Latin Vulgate, writes, "Cornelius Tacitus, who wrote the lives of the Caesars in 30 volumes from Augustus down to the death of Domitian." This is the earliest reference we have of Tacitus writing the Annals, yet it comes almost 300 years after Tacitus actually wrote the document. Yet, the wide consensus of scholars have no issue with saying Tacitus wrote it. For example, Bar Ehrman, who often attacks the Gospels for being anonymous, cites that Tacitus wrote the Annals of Imperial Rome. What you'll see is that we have much better attestation from the Church Fathers that come only decades after the Gospels were written, and so Tacitus's attribution pales in comparison. Take, for example, Papias of Hierapolis, who writes around 105 to 120 AD. He states, "Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatever so he remembered. It was not, however, in exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ, for he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's sayings. Wherefore Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them. For of one thing he took special care, not to omit anything he had heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statements." Of Matthew's Gospel, Papias states, Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as best he could. The Church Father Justin Martyr writes in the 140s AD, For the apostles and the memoirs composed by them, which are called Gospels, have thus delivered unto us what was enjoined upon them. Justin Martyr then goes on to cite a quotation from the Synoptic Gospels. We have good reason to assume that Justin Martyr is referencing the Gospels as we know them, as he quotes various times from the Gospels, including after he states that the apostles wrote them. Irenaeus of Lyon in around 180 AD provides by far a clear account of all four Gospels, but he also cites a similar tradition to Papias with regard to Matthew and Mark. Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. The authorship of the Gospels being anonymous is not something unanimously held by all scholars. There's still a lot of debate. For example, New Testament scholar Mike Licona states, More scholars than not hold to the traditional authorship of both Mark and Luke. A number of critical scholars hold to the traditional authorship of John. So, by no means are scholars set on this issue. When you compare the evidence between the authorship of the Gospels and Tacitus's Annals, I would argue that the Annals of Tacitus pale in comparison. Yet, as stated before, scholars are firm on Tacitus's authorship. These church fathers write only decades after the Gospels being written, and allow us to be almost certain that the apostles and their followers wrote the Gospels. Thanks for watching. If you want to see similar content, please consider liking and subscribing. And as always, God bless.